if we think of meditation as listening to life as it unfolds moment by moment, like learning to live in the listening, learning to live in the emergence rather than trying to control or manage life. There's a way in which we very beautifully remember experientially, because it's not just an auditory listening, but a tactile, embodied listening, our interconnection to all of life, our oneness with. It's not something to philosophize about or think about. It's a physical and spiritual experience. And there's such a tear in the fabric of human relationship today. And also, many people feel a fracture in themselves because they've been discounting or rejecting the dark and just turning towards the light rather than listening to both as sacred and as teachers.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to this next episode of the Awaken Heart podcast. This is a really beautiful conversation with Deborah Eden Tull. She is the author of this amazing book, Luminous Darkness, and she teaches about darkness and how we have it wrong about what darkness is, and only through embracing the darkness are we able to have a radical path to wholeness. And the lawn people are out. That's what you're hearing in the background there. But I'm glad it didn't happen during our conversation. Eden spent over 7 years as a Buddhist monk at a silent Zen monastery. She's a Zen meditation and mindfulness teacher, author, activist, and sustainability educator. She is living in a sustainable community and has been teaching about it for the last 25 years. This is an awesome conversation, especially with the integration of we're seeing a lot of darkness in the world, and we need to approach it as not bad. Oh, there it is. There's the lawn people pausing. We learn to embrace the interplay of both the light and the darkness. Welcome, Deborah Eden Tull, to our podcast. I'm going to be referring to you as Eden. I am so excited to have you here, and I've really been delving into the book that I recently got a copy of, and I'm only a couple pages away from finishing, Luminous Darkness. And it's teaching us how to make friends with the light, or with the dark. So many people everything has to be light, and we're denying our darkness. And you have such an amazing, diverse background. And, you lived in a monastery for, I forgot how many years. Was it 7 years?
7.5. Yes.
7.5 years. And you've done sustainable living, and just, you had some health issues and some tragedies, and just really learning to embrace what it's there to teach you. Like, what is this darkness trying to teach me? And it's just been so awe-inspiring reading your book. And I know I gave a little bit of a background in our introduction, but I'd love for you to give us a little more of your background and what led you to embracing this way of thinking, and how important it's needed in our world right now. I mean, that's a big
Sure.
in a nutshell, and then we can go into more detail into each one.
Happy to speak to this and happy to be here with you. And I'll share first that it's been beautiful to receive so many communications from people around the globe with this book out, who also recognize the important teacher of darkness, the medicine of darkness, and who are grateful that more of us are beginning to speak up in this way. And for me, I feel like everything, my whole life, in a sense, pointed me to the spiritual path and to recognition of both light and dark as our teachers on the path of awakening. So I'm a meditation teacher. I'm here in the mountains of Western North Carolina, Cherokee land, and I really teach the personal, interpersonal, and transpersonal, the ecological, the societal, the mystical aspects of an embodied meditation practice. I'm also a sustainability educator and teach a field of work called the work that reconnects. And a lot of my teachings are about moving beyond or moving towards post-patriarchal thought and practices that honor the deep feminine and the sacred masculine equally. For me, I grew up in a family of artists and activists, and so was really exposed at a young age to both the light and dark in our collective, and got to witness the beauty of parents and community who were willing to roll up their sleeves and be devoted to service, to serving populations in need, and to taking a stand for social justice, and also the messiness and difficulty of all of that. But I was immersed in a community of service for my entire childhood. And at the same time, I also experienced personal loss and the loss of my father and some other very core mentors, starting from the age of 11. And so this opened me up to an inquiry into what is most important in our time here and what is not, that we give our energy to. What does it mean to be fully alive and to live a life of true compassion? We cannot be fully alive if we're continuing to push away one half of our existence, one half of our consciousness, which is the dark. And so many of my experiences in life pointed me to really learning to befriend the part of me who was afraid. Everyone listening can touch into your own relationship with fear, and through befriending the fear, to really choose to access my courage, and my courage on behalf of life, again and again and again. And so at a pretty young age, at the age of 26, I became a Zen Buddhist monastic for the next years to come. And even prior to that, I had made some pretty radical choices to live in intentional community, off the grid, really wanting to know what's possible for humans to live more sustainably in partnership with the earth, and also perhaps more sustainably in relation to one another. That last part, in relation to one another, that intention, or within that intention, I really saw how much the human ego gets in the way, and how much it gets in the way of our attempts to make change. And so that's part of why I chose to go deeper in my spiritual path. There's so much I could say about
Yeah.
what's evolved since, but I'll pause there just to see what wants to emerge in our
Mm.
conversation.
Well, as I was reading your book, I thought it was really interesting how there was still a hierarchy or patriarchy in the monastery, where you had where you had felt sick, and they have you sit with it, and doing so, you weren't listening to your woman's intuition, and how you had vowed to always not push that aside as your woman's intuition. Can you tell a little bit of that story? I know there were two instances that really you could have gotten very sick, and how one, you
Sure.
healed yourself, and the other one, you were out for a couple weeks afterwards.
Yes. Yeah. So I want to acknowledge that one of the things I'm pointing to in the book overall is the invitation that I believe darkness offers to release hierarchical perception and learn instead to perceive clearly from the heart. And I can say more about that later. But hierarchical perception exists in each and every one of our psyches. And as I point out in the book, it also exists in our spiritual communities, in so much of how we set up culture. And the monastery where I trained was a great example of a place of incredible teachings and incredible practice. But because within Buddhism, for instance, so much of what has come down the lineages and now both gets taught through secular mindfulness and through Buddhism, got passed down through male monasticism. And there are just some real differences in male monasticism and how people and what people need living out in the world today, perhaps as householders and relationships and with families. So I want to set that context. And so I pointed out that, for instance, at the monastery where I trained, there was a system where it's really part of practice to let go of ego's agenda at every turn. And this is a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there can be in spiritual communities a monitoring of how this is going on, in a system where, to make sure you're not coming from your ego, let's say, we're going to always have you seek guidance from higher ups. Here we go with the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So I shared an instance both where I got what was actually a poisonous black widow spider bite and went to seek guidance. And instead of being guided in a wise way to seek medical attention, it was sit with it. I would ask listeners to just consider ways in your own practice you've either experienced this kind of hierarchy or have diminished or dampened your own inner knowing in the name of something spiritual. That's something could be interesting for listeners to inquire into. So it ended up being that it wasn't until the venom was pulsing through my entire body that I got to a doctor and was told I nearly died and had over 2 weeks needed for recovery. But it's such a great example of what happens when we are spiritual learners, not taking agency for our own practice, but instead sometimes perhaps blindly within systems or communities that are actually set up still with this hierarchy. I'm really pointing out in this book that it's time for humans to reach a little further in terms of, instead of the power over model that we're so used to that has caused so much harm in our world, what does it look and feel like to live and practice in shared power, in power with? And the last thing I'll say about this right now is just that, in all honesty, when we meditate and truly drop into presence, presence is a place of shared presence, of witness, of the myth of separation dissolving. So meditation is our greatest guide, I believe, to learning what it means to live in shared power rather than power over. So thanks for that question.
Mm-hmm. And there's something that I noted that you had said in your book. We meditate to remember the already awakened state. It is through doing nothing but surrendering that we realize wholeness. And that began the next phase of your practice, which was profound power of receptivity and surrendering.
Yes.
Speak into that a little more. How it is about
Yeah.
opening up, receiving, and surrendering.
Thank you. And first, let's make the connection between darkness and receptivity.
Mm-hmm.
In nature and consciousness, there exists both light and dark, and they exist in partnership and in dynamic interplay. And think of light as the more active, the more yang, the expressive aspect of nature, and darkness as the yin. We're talking about elemental darkness, the receptive, the still, the quiet. And in a world that's been informed by patriarchy, there is absolutely a preference in the dominant paradigm towards light. The active is strength, force is power, right? This kind of thing. Let's get to the light. Rational mind is another thing we can connect with, the light, the lamp of knowledge, and pushing away of darkness, non-doing, receptivity. So through meditation, we reconnect with the power of our innate receptivity, learning not to approach mindfulness and meditation as something to do, or compassion as something we can do. It's just an action, but softening our effort, recognizing that we've been conditioned, most of us, to bring mental effort towards even things which do not require any mental effort, and instead learning to soften into the yin and just receive the moment as it is, ourselves as we are, life as it is, one another as we are. This motion is remembering the already awakened state in my experience and in my teachings, because awareness is already awake. We don't have to do something to get there or find it. It's about remembering it by emptying or non-doing. And this is really a motion of the yin, an emotion that expresses the power of the yin. So just to remind people of that, because I imagine there are people listening who can connect with this way that, yeah, I too grew up in a world where power was force and doing and attaining and getting somewhere, not emptying and resting. Yeah.
Mm. And it's in being instead of doing. You are being because you're already it. And we put
Yes.
all these layers, and our mind and everything goes in place of it instead of listening. You spoke into a lot about listening and witnessing, and we're always trying to get somewhere, but we're already there. We're already it. And it's releasing, like you said, surrendering into that in that deep state of
Yes.
receptivity.
And I just want to say something about relational forms of knowing and relational intelligence. This is part of what we wake up to, what we remember that already exists within us. That, if we think of meditation as listening to life as it unfolds moment by moment, like learning to live in the listening, learning to live in the emergence rather than trying to control or manage life. There's a way in which we very beautifully remember experientially, because it's not just an auditory listening, but a tactile, embodied listening, our interconnection to all of life, our oneness with. It's not something to philosophize about or think about. It's a physical and spiritual experience. And there's such a tear in the fabric of human relationship today. And also, many people feel a fracture in themselves because they've been discounting or rejecting the dark and just turning towards the light rather than listening to both as sacred and as teachers. It offers such important healing in today's world. I just want to emphasize that.
Mm-hmm. And there's, we always think of the light, the daytime gets so much, everything is in the daytime, but there's so much that is done during the nighttime that can't be done during the daytime with the sun. So it's, we're reaching for the sun when we need to, reach for the moon. Well, moon more so, integrating those two parts. There's not a division. It all is the same. It's all together. It's in one, just like the masculine and feminine. There's different energies, but it's when we reject one part of ourselves that we're making one side wrong when we need both of them together as a whole. And there's a lot with the dark feminine, the solar feminine, which I experienced over the last couple of years, that I was making it wrong because I felt so masculine because I was so enraged with what I saw happening in the world. And it's for that horrible dark period, and for hundreds of years, women were like kept down, or they had their dark feminine where they were wise and they were healers. And the dark ages, I like how you explained the dark ages and what it actually was, how we didn't just know the history for that period of time. That's what it was. But a lot of women were tried during that time just for simply being, wise, beautiful, souls,
Yes.
and how a
And
lot of that's still
also,
hanging over us.
yes. And also in that time, many people were tried for practicing spiritual pathways which recognize the body and our connection with the earth as our pathway to the divine, rather than going through either the rational mind or going through the church with the male interface as our pathway. And many of these land-based practices were absolutely demonized during this time. It was a time when, so the 18th century in Europe, the Age of Enlightenment was an age celebrating rationalization and rational mind as God. Think of the impact of the Cartesian era on our world today, and relational forms of knowing and intuition, imagination, the kind of deep listening that mystics know well. All of this was absolutely demonized. And it's important to recognize the impact that that still has on us today, collectively, and the way that, well, there were many people today I know who come to mindfulness or meditation, for instance, and find that, oh my gosh, I wasn't aware of how in my head I've been living. I wasn't aware that my thinking mind had become center of gravity. And this is part of the residue of a society so disconnected from the earth and so focused on rational mind as God. And so it's really an invitation within this book, where I speak about the need for endarkenment alongside enlightenment, to recognize this whole field of relational forms of knowing as an incredible and foundational part of the spiritual practice, and our connection with the body and the earth. Really, the phrase I use is our earth body, because it's not how we think about the body in sort of modern Western cosmology. This is part of what is needed, I think, to wake us up, to shake us awake in today's world from anthropocentricity and egocentricity. And you just pointed to this using a different word, wake centricity, the sort of focus on daytime is where our real life happens and our whole life happens. And the notion that what we see is real and set in stone and what we get, instead of recognizing the interplay of day and night, of light and dark, of what we see and the world beyond what we can see, which are all part of this human and earth experience. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that comes to mind, the soft gaze. I mean, there's walking meditations, but the soft gaze, how we're always, how we're looking at a certain thing, but then we're missing everything else that's around us. And of course, we're only picking up so much. What is it, like 1 or 2% of what we're filtering out? So
Yep.
many things that we're not seeing. So many. We see a lot in the dark as well. But it's softening the gaze to open up to more that's around you.
Yes. So I share an experience of before I was a monastic and did my first long retreat, and then lived at Green Gulch Farm in Muir Beach, California, and was invited into the soft gaze of Zen, just learning how to relax our eyes in their sockets and allow our eyes to be open, but receiving, and receiving the whole rather than seeing through a single pointed way or agenda way that you were just describing well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting for people to just consider the impact of how often we use our eyes actively in a way that stimulates the discriminating mind or detail-oriented mind, rather than the kind of seeing with the heart, which involves all of our senses and awareness, that does not so much perceive, is not focused on separation, but the wholeness of things. And this is important. It's important to acknowledge, even when we soften our gaze or close our eyes, our other senses become stronger. And I believe our listening, sensing, feeling, receptive capacity is needed both to navigate our spiritual path, and to navigate all the challenges we're facing today. So that's one of the encouragements that this book offers. Yeah.
And it's like
Yeah.
the heart connection, because you're not, when you're looking at something, you're in your mind more. When you're operating from your heart in a softer gaze, you're becoming more aware internally through feeling of
Yes.
what's around you. And that's what's so important, is for us
Yes.
to get from here, our brains, to our hearts and to our core, where, you know, where the real intelligence really is. I mean, we need our mind for so many things, but we're using it for way too much, and we're missing that connection, like you said, to the whole, or to, you know, more depth.
Yes. And we're spending a lot of time with that mind assessing habit in duality. So having a subject object relationship to life rather than being in the field or in the flow, in the river of life itself, perceiving wholeness. And we're also, well, people might not be so aware of this, often engaging through marketplace mentality, kind of a not just subject object, but consumer and what I'm consuming. And certainly with all of the um, amount of social media and computer use, and more of this is occurring. So it's relieving to get to free ourselves from that kind of perception and instead remember how and remember what it means to perceive with the heart and to perceive from a non-separate lens. So that's a whole conversation about the meditation path. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah. What else should we look at here?
You talked about, well, going into this, it relates, it's healing the spirit body divide. How so many of us have been, I mean, a lot, the soft gaze and meditation can help that as well, but we're disconnected from spirit, we're disconnected from the earth as a collective, as a whole. I mean, there's people that aren't, but as a majority we are. How do we heal that body mind spirit divide?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. First, I just think it's interesting to consider, I've been teaching meditation for decades now, and so often, especially new meditators, but for some people this can go on for a while, it's almost like something that they're approaching for self-improvement or to fix myself, to change myself, or because it's a good person thing to be. And so that justifies the unconscious habit of meeting whatever we do with effort and mental effort. So it becomes like mental effort to try to meditate. And they can even bring effort to as they're breathing instead of letting the breath breathe us, and to how do I relax? What are the 10 steps for relaxation, instead of letting the body guide us. And the more in practice we learn to, again, I'm going to emphasize, soften this effort and soften the mental activity, which can really require some courage and trust, because it can feel scary at first, and go down into our bodies, not labeling different parts of our bodies, not going down into our bodies with agenda, but recognizing the subtle body, the energetic body within the body, recognizing that our bodies both exist with this physical size and with dimensions, and on a spiritual level, through our awareness, expand beyond that. What happens when we listen to our bodies and our subtle body in a deeper way is that we recognize that we are not separate from the earth, we are the earth. We recognize that we are not separate from one another, we are one another. We recognize that there is no separation, and that changes how we experience, it changes how we act towards, it changes how we show up. And Buddhism teaches that we live with one foot in the relative world and the absolute truth. So we're not cutting off one or the other. We're learning how to live in both, but to really acknowledge this trance of separation, this myth of separation, how strong it's become of a pulse within the dominant paradigm today. a sense that we are separate when we are not, and how we act from that false sense of separation. So coming back to our bodies, our earth bodies, our subtle body, um, it reminds us even this body is an ecosystem, just like the earth is an ecosystem made up of myriad ecosystems. So to bring respect and reverence and friendship to all aspects of these systems, nothing operates separately in an isolated way. To bring reverence to these systems. And this helps us to bring reverence to the interplay between light and dark. And I'll just add that even within nature, let's go back for a moment to your earlier recognition of the feminine. The embryo rests in the womb in yin, darkened stillness for 9 months, and all of the growth and development that occurs held by the darkness. And then at the end of the 9 months, the womb, that same field, becomes one of the most powerful muscles that could be to actively give birth. It's the interplay, it's both. But if we continue to diminish the yin receptive side, there's a whole lot that we're losing out on. And certainly we're not going to be able to have a healthy relationship with our body, because sometimes our bodies need to slow. Sometimes our bodies experience illness. Sometimes our bodies need nothing but the medicine of rest. So we have to hold both as valuable if we're going to honor the body. Does that resonate with your life experience? Yeah.
Oh, yes, it does. And it's being in a state of curiosity and openness instead of a victim mentality. Like, why is this why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to me? Or what is this teaching me? But like not so much in the head so much, but you always it's feeling it in the body instead of like going into the mind so much, but like
Yes.
approaching with more curiosity instead of making something wrong,
Yes.
because everything is here to teach us something, whether we like it or not, whether our consciousness likes it or not. There's some deeper reason all these things are happening. It's for our own growth and it's for our own evolution.
Yes. And I would just remind people that the more we, um, for instance, meditate and soften into presence, the more there's a natural organic integration of body mind that occurs. Not something we have to make happen, it just occurs. And so we're not trying to cut off the mind in any way whatsoever, but we're acknowledging, wow, in today's world, for so many, it has become an overused center.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah,
And that brings up, I like your term sunshining, and how a
yeah,
lot of us are sunshining. It's like spiritual bypassing, where we're not acknowledging the emotions that are in our body. Everything's perfect. And, going into the positive. A lot of people in the spiritual community do that as well. And like, just forget it and turn this other way and be positive instead of sitting with that which is wanting to be heard and felt and seen, which is not a wrong aspect of ourselves, but it's part of ourselves, or else it wouldn't be there. So,
yes,
yeah.
yeah. So I talk about growing up in LA and kind of this culture that I
Mhm.
experienced
I
of
lived there
sunshining, of, as you said, okay,
for 21 years. Yeah.
um, got it. Keep it light, or maybe keep it surface, and always kind of this avoiding of the deeper, darker undercurrents. When I was going through grief, I noticed how many people were afraid of or didn't know how to be with someone in grief. There's a way in which, yes, it becomes a spiritual bypass, and it's so freeing and so relieving to wake up from that sun shining and simply get to uh, choose a life where it is all welcome and where we're not spending so much energy. Think about the energy for a moment that actually goes into labeling everything positive versus negative, good versus bad, right versus wrong. Life happens. We have the capacity to meet it all with compassionate welcome. And consciousness, awareness is not labeling. It's our conditioned mind that is. But there's another part of us that is already intact, awareness itself, that is not engaged in that kind of labeling.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very different and freeing way to experience life. Yeah. Yeah.
Then we're not in judgment, and we're not in judgment of ourselves, and we're not in judgment of others, because everyone comes with their own, their own life stories and their own perceptions. And, meeting everybody, as you had said, with a beginner's mind, and meeting each emotion or everything that comes up with a beginner's mind. What is this trying to teach us or tell us? And I like what you said. We meet life with the wonder and openness of a child. We meet life empty and open rather than full. And in
Thank you for bringing that in.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, just to acknowledge in a world where the expert is celebrated and where we've seen so many leaders, in fact, act out of integrity or screw up by trying to protect themselves as the expert, instead of being willing to acknowledge, oh, maybe we're all learners here. If we're
Mm-hmm.
beginners, we can acknowledge in transparency that we're learning. And we can celebrate this process of learning. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I try to, when I see myself going into judgment myself, I mean, it's always a practice within myself, because I do notice times when I'm like, wow, I'm being judgmental. Like, and then I try to, I go into a place of more compassion, and knowing that they're all coming in with their own stuff, and having more compassion with them. So, let's see. I know, before we wrap this up, I would like to speak into endarkment a little more. You had, I believe, different steps about endarkment. I like how you said, instead of waking up, we're walking down on the path to endarkment. And just speaking about everything that we seek is already within ourselves. How can somebody go about um, embracing the darkness and endarkment? Like, what are some steps that they can begin?
Sure. Yeah, yeah. Well, first, just something practical. And I want people to consider how much time all of our ancestors spent in physical darkness, because
Mhm.
electricity is a very new thing. And because today we're living in a world where over 60% of the globe and over 90% of the US and Europe is brightly lit at night. So to acknowledge what's gotten lost by not spending as much time under the dark night sky, the wonder, the
Mm.
sense of all possibility, the acknowledgement of all that we do not know, the reverence for the mystery, the recognition of the more than human realm. This human realm is not the only realm. And to spend some time in darkness. And that can include just spending time with the eyes closed and in the soft gaze. I invite people to pause throughout the day and just remember that even in the space you're resting in, it was purely dark some hours ago and will be completely dark some hours to come. And to just see what that awakens in your psyche. Um, there are a lot of fun practices in the book, a lot, and inquiries. But one really simple thing that kind of tags upon some of what we've talked about with the receptive and the deep listening and the softening effort is just a short practice called conscious allowing and doing nothing, inviting people to sit or lie down for just a period of time, maybe set the timer for 10 or 15 minutes. And don't try to meditate. Don't come with any big agenda. Really invite yourself to do nothing, to consciously allow life to be exactly as it is. Now, of course, as listeners are aware, this is a meditation, but it's about really noticing what comes up for you in the mirror of the invitation to do nothing, to soften effort, and seeing what happens when you really surrender to that. Because in that motion, we are surrendering to darkness, all of light, all creativity, all possibility. It all arises from darkness. So we enter a much more graceful and, I would say, passionate dance with life when we're willing more to embrace and rest in the darkness, as well as let the light come through. And it's in our experiences, I just want to end with this, of turning towards rather than away from the dark, of navigating the darkness, the unknown, the uncertainty, that we recognize that the inner light is unwavering. It's unwavering. We don't have to do anything to try to whip ourselves into shape to access it or push away and get rid of all of our shadows in order to finally see it. The light was never lost, so it can't be found through that kind of efforting, but it can be remembered, and we can stabilize our recognition that that is who we are when we start dropping this judgment towards darkness. So
Mm-hmm.
just that encouragement to people. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
lovely. That's a really wonderful. And you do have so many great practices in this book, and I've used some of them, like laying in bed and listening to music with the lights off. And how does it feel? It feels so different. And there's that quote, when my eyes are closed, wait, when my eyes are, wait, when it's dark, my eyes begin to see. Is that the right quote? In
Beautiful.
in the
Yes.
darkness, my eyes begin to see. And I always think of that because when I do close my eyes, and it's been like this my whole life, or when it's dark, it's not dark, it's not this black inky darkness. I literally see dots everywhere. I've always seen little
Yes.
dots. I was looking at my cat yesterday at 2 in the morning, and she was just all these vibrating dots all over the place. So I really feel like my eyes do see more at nighttime because we're enveloped in darkness. We don't feel separate. I don't feel separate from anything. It's wrapped all around me. And
Yes.
it is a
Yeah.
it is a beautiful gifting place to be. Yes.
Well, thank you so much
Yes.
for this rich conversation
Yes.
and for
Thank
sharing
you.
your own experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And before we go, where can people find you, and what is lighting you up right now? What is next on your plate, or what are you passionate about right now?
Sure. You can find me at deborahEdenTull.com. The website is my full name, and there's all kinds of offerings around luminous darkness. And of no surprise, part of what's lighting me up right now is the felt sense of winter coming. I
Mm,
love every season, summer, spring, autumn, and the unique invitation of winter right now with the shortening of the days and the darkening of the sky, and this invitation to slow down and reflect even more. There's a process I offer in many forms, day-long retreats, online, residential retreats, in December and January. That's a beautiful process of reflection before sowing new seeds for the new year. And so my whole being begins to enter this process right about now. We're towards the end of November, and it's a kind of harvesting from this past year and a kind of learning more deeply from this past year before stepping through the threshold of the new year. So that's
mhm,
what's lighting me up right now.
mm.
Yeah. Thank you for asking.
You're welcome. And one last
Yeah.
thing, what does it mean for you to live with an awakened heart?
Hmm. Beautiful question. It means to me to live every day and night recognizing everything that arises as a teacher of love and being devoted to the path of love, and recognizing, which I hope I've made clear through this conversation about light and dark, that love includes the entire spectrum, that love includes the most profound expression of courage as well as the most gentle compassion, that it includes all of it. And I appreciate that question because to me it's very simple. There's nothing that happens, nothing that arises that isn't a teacher in remembering that our capacity for love is far greater than most of us have been taught in a conditionally loving society.
Mm.
Yeah.
I love that. Beautiful. Well, thank you, Eden, so much for being here. And I want everybody, this is probably backwards here, to pick up this book. And she has many other books. So you'll have to find her online and find some of the um, wonderful programs that she's offering. And now is a time to go inward and prepare ourselves for the new year. And a great time of change and reflection. So thank you so much, Eden, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.